we start.
Hey, welcome everyone. We'll be starting in a few minutes around 11. Thank you for joining. And while we wait to start, feel free to sign up for some of our other upcoming webinars. We have a few related to nutrition, hunger for military families and veterans, as well as a WIC 101 training coming up. We also have a webinar coming up August 4th around vaccines and the importance of immunizations with two pediatricians, Dr. Sinnert and Dr. Dentz. And they'll be talking all about the importance of immunizations just in time to go back to school. So again, you can sign up for all our upcoming events on our website. The link is in the chat box. Welcome everyone. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Okay, so we can go ahead and get started. I know Megan has a lot of information to get to everyone, so let's go ahead and start. So this will be a 1-hour webinar. There'll be a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A box. A set of the slides and the recording for this session will be available tomorrow. We'll send it out in an email. And also, as a reminder, sign up for our other upcoming events. We have one around addressing hunger among military families and veterans, a WIC 101 training all about the Women, Infant, and Children's Program. And we also have another training on August 4th coming up around the importance of vaccines. So feel free to sign up for our other upcoming trainings. And this webinar is Addressing the Childhood Mental Health Crisis Part 2. We did Part 1 in May, and Part 1 we had Tennessee Voices for Children. They talked about suicide and depression screening for children and all about that. You can find the recording online on our YouTube page. So for those who aren't super familiar with TJC, you can go to the next slide. Yeah, for those who aren't super familiar with the work of TJC, we are a nonprofit public interest law firm. We do individual client representations and casework to help us identify systemic issues and risks to the state safety programs such as TennCare, SNAP, Our Kids, WIC, and TANF. And then from that, we advocate for change through legislative action, changes at both the state and federal level. Again, through class action litigation, and as well as client representation at administrative hearings. And one of the ways we advocate is through partnering with organizations like 0 to 3. And today we have Megan Smelzer from 0 to 3, who is the infant, you can go to the next slide, who is the infant mental health mentor / clinical senior policy analyst. And she's going to talk to you all a bit about infant and early childhood mental health and the work she does and ways you all can advocate for children. So Megan, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Heaven. It's great to be here with all of you and share this time today to talk about my favorite thing of infant and early childhood mental health. So I am going to, we'll run through the agenda, but I have an ask of you to start with. If you can take a second and go grab a sticky note or a piece of paper or just something small to write on, we're going to need this for later at the end of the presentation. But as you go find that, I'm going to run through the agenda today. So we're going to do some more quick introductions of myself and then of you as to see who's joining us today. I'm going to give some foundational information around understanding infant and early childhood mental health. And then we're going to talk about prevalence rates, cost of adversity. We're going to have some data in there and then move to barriers and stigma and then end on a high note in terms of building resilience and prevention and talking about some next steps. So in my due diligence, I reviewed the first session of this webinar series and was happy to see that as those folks closed their presentation, they really ended on hope for the future and talking about early intervention as being a positive risk factor, talking about education, prevention, assessment, and treatment. And that really plays in really nicely to what I'm talking about today. I'm just talking about the birth to 5 span of things. So obviously the first one was not a prerequisite for today in any way, but I just wanted to highlight the thread between the two. So starting with introductions. So as Heaven said, I am Megan and I'm with 0 to 3. I started in October of last year. I live and am currently in the great state of Michigan, although our office from 0 to 3 is in Washington, D.C. And before October, I was actually at the state of Michigan as the infant and early childhood mental health coordinator for the state of Michigan. And within that role, I supported our state's mental health consultation team and then just did all things birth to 5 mental health. So that's my lens. I also come to you as a wife and a mom, and here are my inspirations, Tessa, William, and Sana. And I often have times where my personal and my professional life cross over. And so if you hear that coming through, that's these are the reasons, they are the reasons why I do this great work. I also am very much oriented and with my lens of being from the Midwest, from Michigan, very clinically oriented, although now I'm in the policy world, I'm very firmly rooted in that. And I'm also grounded with having a trauma focus and very centered on racial equity. So you'll hear those probably all the way through, but just to name them from the beginning. So it's a little bit about me. I would love to hear a little bit about who's in the room here. We have one poll. Oh, see, here's the problem is that I'm advancing both of my slides from my notes and this. So I'm probably going to jump between the two and forget one or the other. So please bear with me. So we're going to take a quick poll. So Heaven, or someone on your end, can you pop the poll up? We're just going to see who's in the room today and name what your primary role is. We'll just have this up for just maybe 15, 20 seconds. But it gives you and me just a good feel for who we're talking with today. Looks like we have lots of advocates, lots of service providers, mental health folks, physician, great, state government staff. Oh, and I should say, if you don't see your role here, pop it in the chat. That would be great. Researcher, and we have a few others. Heaven, I can't see the chat right now. Is there any way you could read who is else that we missed in this poll?
Yeah, Annette says she's a primary care nurse case manager, and Charmaine says she's a care coordinator.
Very cool. Wonderful. All right.
And
Oops.
someone said they're a health case manager, IMH Association, an instructional coach.
Very cool. Wonderful. All right, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. That just helps give me a little orientation to this. So I'm going to close this down, and then we are going to jump in. So for some of you, this might be new information. For others, hopefully it's a refresher, but either way, we love starting off with this picture. This is actually Ren. She is the daughter of my director, Lindsay. And we just find the irony of, as a toddler, reading up on her emotional life of toddlers is a great way to start. So you can see the definition here on the slide of infant early childhood mental health, but some other words that you might hear around or alluding to mental health include ACEs or trauma, social and emotional, attachment, whatever. All of those words really are about painting a picture of how healthy relationships with adults support the optimal development of little ones, and mental health is literally at the heart of it. And I'll also say that infant and early childhood mental health is inextricably tied to social and emotional health and well-being. Often people use these terms interchangeably because it feels a bit more accessible, and quite honestly, the acronym is a little bit easier, but there are a few nuanced differences, but it's if you hear one, you think the other. What this ultimately looks like is really when kids and little ones are trusting and curious and persistent and self-confident and motivated, and all of these characteristics support the learning process and success later in life. I also want to take a pause for a moment here and explicitly say at the beginning that when we're talking about social emotional well-being and mental health for infants and toddlers, and really for all people, because at any age, we all have mental health, and that's a good thing, that these concepts are really inclusive of one's racial identity, which is also actively developing in the first few years of life. So when we're talking about social emotional development and mental health concepts from the get-go for everyone, we must include race and centering racial equity as a foundational principle to policy and practice. And a guidepost that we really use is a body of work called the Diversity Informed Tenets by the Irving Harris Foundation. There's a note, later we'll talk a little bit more about that, and there's a link in the resources, but I just wanted to name that now so it'll be a little bit familiar to you when we talk about it in a few minutes. So why is this important? Well, infant early childhood mental health is literally the foundation for all future development, including self-regulation capacity, cognitive capacity, foundation of self-worth and self-concept, physical growth, language acquisition, all of it. And while positive early learning experiences promote strong emotional health, negative experiences, if you can imagine, such as exposure to trauma and toxic stress, they also including experiences of racism, can adversely impact brain development with serious lifelong and often intergenerational consequences. So this is why I find that there isn't much more important than really getting this part right in the first 5 years of life. So how does this develop? Well, early experiences, like we said, literally shape the architecture of developing brains and influence health and well-being for the rest of life. And in fact, the Center on Developing Child at Harvard University explains or estimates that the brain forms more than 1 million neural connections every second in the first year of life. Think about that, how big that is. 1 million connections every second. It's mind-boggling. And we know that the mental health status of the child strongly correlates with the mental health status of the primary caregiver. And when I say primary caregiver, I mean mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or auntie or child care provider, whomever spends the most time caring for these little ones. And so therefore, if the adult who cares for this little one is struggling with emotional or social emotional issues, the child is at a much greater risk of developing his or her own mental health challenges in the future. So therefore, brain development is dependent on early relationships. And to illustrate this is a story from Carol Siegel from the University of Minnesota that we like to share. So Carol explains that when a family brings a baby home from the hospital, one of the few ways that a baby lets a caregiver know they're in distress is by crying, right? Everybody knows that. And when the baby cries, mom or dad says, "Baby, I hear you, I'm coming." they pick up baby, they help her calm down. The next time baby cries, mom or dad say again, I hear you, baby, I'm coming. They pick baby up, they help her calm down. And each time they do that, they're teaching her two things. Well, they're teaching her lots of things, but two things that she's learning is one, that she can trust that someone is coming to help her and inherently connecting that adults are safe and helpful creatures. And two, she's learning to calm herself down with that of the help of the adult. She can't do that in a healthy way on her own, and we call that co-regulation. So eventually, time after time again, the caregiver attends to her cries. Soon when the baby cries, mom or dad can say, I hear you, baby, I'm coming. And the baby will calm down just by hearing the sound of the caregiver's voice. And when you think about that, that is just amazingly powerful. And so what this illustrates is that babies learn from birth, and they know at a very young age that they have an impact on the world. And so this is a great example of consistent and attuned parenting. But let's think for a moment what it might be like for babies who don't have their cries answered or needs met more consistently. And what do they learn? And what do they think about adults or expect from them in their life? And again, these patterns start little, but these expectations and these templates continue in every relationship for the rest of their life. So thinking about those exponential consequences. And if they experience inconsistent care or abuse or neglect, that has direct and significant impact on their emotional and relational health. They can and do experience mental health problems. And we're going to talk more about that shortly. So ACEs. I'm going to assume that all of you are at least familiar with the concept of adverse childhood experiences. So I'm not going to belabor this, but I want to make the explicit point and connection between trauma and infant and early childhood mental health. And again, because of the rapid brain development, all experiences have tremendous impact during these first 3 years of life. And therefore, something really scary happens to a baby or young child without support, this can trigger really big feelings, overwhelming feelings of fear and anxiety, which disrupt their ability to learn and develop as they move forward in the milestones along the way. So I'm going to ask for a second, think about the last time that you were really scared or really anxious. Just think about that for a second. And in that moment, how able would you be to learn a new skill like replacing your garbage disposal or learning French? Probably not well. I know, definitely I couldn't do that. And neither can these little ones. And so one of my new favorite quotes is actually one that one of my colleagues from 0 to 3 posted on LinkedIn the other day. And I love this quote here in blue and yellow, because it really underscores the vital importance of the dependence that children have on the adults in their life, not to protect them from everything, because we know that's not possible, but to offer support and validation and comfort, especially when something hurtful or traumatic happens. And the detrimental implications when there is no caring, attuned adult around to offer support, or worse, when the adult who's responsible for the care and love and protection is actually the one who is the source of trauma and fear and hurt. And those situations actually create the most complex trauma for babies and young children. So unsurprisingly, hopefully unsurprisingly, at this point, ACEs are linked to chronic health problems and mental illness and substance misuse in adulthood, and thus can negatively impact education and job opportunities down the line. And it's also important to note here that some children are at a greater risk than others of experiencing ACEs. The CDC notes that women and several racial and ethnic minority groups are at a greater risk for experiencing 4 or more types of ACEs due to racial inequality and injustice and racism. So we all have to be very mindful of this as well. Unfortunately, we don't have time to dive deep into that now, but we really must have these conversations within our teams and smaller groups. I also feel compelled to say that we also bring our own ACEs history to work. And so it is important for us to be aware of and have effective ways to manage our own experiences of big feelings, especially when we get triggered, because in all of the work that you do, I know there are some really intense moments, and working with families can bring up really big feelings in us too. And so in short, it's so critical to pay attention and honor our own mental health needs and find healthy ways to get these needs met too. So that was a more personal and micro example, but to pull this back out a little bit wider and give some more macro context. When we're talking about infant and early childhood mental health, we like to describe the continuum of relationship-based activities spanning from promotion to treatment. Promotion looks like raising awareness, talking about the critical nature of mental health and encouraging positive infant and early childhood mental health development. Prevention can involve screening for and identifying risk factors or mitigating the impacts of ACEs, and providing caregivers like childcare providers and teachers services like mental health consultation services. Assessment and diagnosis involves providing a thorough assessment and accurate diagnosis using a developmentally and age appropriate classification, such as the DC 0 to 5. Again, a tool from 0 to 3. And assessment and diagnosis really ideally should take place over a minimum of 3 to 5 visits and over a period of several weeks. And I know that when it comes to diagnosing, many people have many big feelings about this. So it's important to note that we do not diagnose the child, we diagnose the condition. And again, that's a nuanced shift in language, but it is so important to note in order to talk about and to mitigate some of these concerns around stigma and such that families, have really do feel. Finally, treatment is about providing evidence-based services and supports intended to directly address the mental health disorders, and treatment is often aimed at supporting or repairing a primary attachment relationship between the adult and the child. And so 2 examples of evidence-based practices that are most widely known, I would say, are child-parent psychotherapy, CPP, or parent-child interaction therapy, PCIT, if you've ever heard of those. And so I recognize that in many states, not just Tennessee, there's a very real workforce crisis and shortage for early childhood in general, and specifically for mental health treatment for little ones. So supporting organizations like your very own Association of Infant Mental Health in Tennessee, or AIM High Tennessee, is a fantastic way to advocate for and increase the support of infant and early childhood mental health workforce. In fact, I believe we might even have the executive director of AIM High Tennessee with us today, Angela Webster. If she was here, if we were in person, I would have her stand up and wave. So maybe she can say hi in the chat if she's on. But I have the great delight of working with her in a couple different ways and avenues. And when I was telling her about the presentation today, she informed me of this beautiful partnership that she has with Allied Behavioral Health Solutions and Allison Peak and the Tennessee First 5 Training Institute. And so right now, they are already working on ways to build this clinical workforce capacity in the state, which is just such a cool thing and very innovative. And so I want to give a shout to them. And I think someone will be dropping links in the chat and are also in the resource page for both AIM High Tennessee and Allied Behavioral Health Solutions as well. So I always like to make those hometown connections whenever I can. So that was a bit of an overview of the foundational points of infant and early childhood mental health. And now for all of you data lovers, we can talk some numbers. And when we're talking about children at risk, the children in foster care system rise to the top for sure. I'm going to share some national numbers first, and then we'll talk about Tennessee numbers. So children under the age of 3 enter foster care at a much higher rate than any other age group at 32.8%. And babies under the year of 1 are the greatest risk. And in fact, in fiscal year 19, they made up of 19% of the total kids in foster care. And when hearing these statistics, some may think, well, this isn't so bad, right? Like these kids are too young to remember and they're born resilient, so they'll just grow out of any issues that they have. But because of the way that we know that brains develop, kids do remember. They just remember differently in adults, not in their brain because their brain is not fully developed yet, but really within their bodies. And so therefore we know that at the very cellular level, these experiences can be so incredibly traumatic for kids. And without careful attention to these experiences, they can create scars that literally last a lifetime. And even we're learning that in different ways they can be passed down to their own children, and that intergenerational piece of things. And so what happens during this point in time in life truly, truly matters. And so with this information, it shouldn't be too surprising that children experience mental health disorders at roughly the same rate as older kids, at a range between 10 and 16%. And young kids who live in families dealing with parental loss or substance misuse or mental health issues or exposure to historical traumas are at a heightened risk of developing these disorders. And unsurprisingly, the stressors of poverty and racism multiply these risks. And so if left untreated, infant and early childhood mental health disorders can have detrimental effects, like we said, on every aspect of a child's development. And of course, behavior, and therefore ultimately impact a child's ability to succeed in school and life down the line. And in fact, children who do not achieve early social and emotional milestones, thus the reason, another great plug for screening early for social and emotional milestones, often perform poorly, including in childcare and in preschool and in kindergarten, and are at a much higher risk for suspension and expulsion and then juvenile delinquency later in life. We all know the trajectory of when a 15-year-old gets kicked out of school. Just rewind that a decade or so. And so, for example, national data show that young children in childcare are expelled at a rate 13 times higher than all K-12 expulsions combined. I'm going to say that again because that's crazy. And so many people have never heard the statistic that kids in childcare and preschool are expelled at a rate 13 times higher than K through 12 expulsions combined. And further, Tennessee data from your very own Department of Education show glaring disparities in which Black kindergartners were involved in 54% of the disciplinary incidents, but only make up 25% of the population. So clearly there's more going on here than just behavioral issues. And this conversation about implicit bias and other factors are really important to have with folks in your own teams and agencies if you haven't already. 0 to 3 also every year puts out something called the State of Babies Yearbook. And what that is, if you haven't heard of it, it is a wealth of data that our agency does on every state. And so you should be seeing it in the chat. The Tennessee data for State of Babies Yearbook, again, is also in the resources. You can find that on the 0 to 3 website. So as you're going through and needing data, it just paints a really comprehensive picture of little ones in every state. So let's talk about a different set of numbers and ask, what is the very real cost of adversity? And as we said, one of the most prevalent risks to infant and early childhood mental health is unmitigated exposure to ACEs and trauma. And here you can see the ACE study found at a population level, a dose response relationship, which means the more ACEs someone experiences, the more health issues that they experience later in life. And many of these examples are physical ailments such as cancer and heart disease, mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety, alcoholism, drug abuse are also incredibly common. And of course, these all impact school readiness, educational attainment, community contribution, all of these things. We talked about increased rates of suspension and expulsion, absenteeism, increased lost time from work. Also probably, hopefully not too surprising, increased risk for experiences of an interface with the juvenile justice and criminal justice worlds, and really resulting in part often from diagnosable mental health needs that were just left unmet. So looking at this visual here depicts which proportion of these adult health conditions could be eliminated if we eliminated exposure to ACEs. And it's important to note that the original ACE study only included 10 forms of adversity and did not capture other sources of trauma and toxic stress that we know have significant health impacts, including historical trauma and experiences of racism as well. So those numbers are even bigger. And so when we look at these figures, we begin to get a real sense of the enormous cost, quite frankly, of early adversity. And in fact, the Institute of Medicine estimates that direct and indirect costs of ACEs total $247 billion with a B dollars annually every year. So of course, this impacts federal and state spending on budgets on healthcare and education and child welfare and criminal justice and overall economic productivity. Just imagine what we could do with an extra $247 billion annually. I have some thoughts. Hopefully, I'm sure you do too. So when we're talking about, with just those few data points, it's very clear to see the importance of intervening early. Again, we're talking about prenatal to the 5. That's our great window. Prenatal to 3, but really prenatal to 5 is a little bit bigger. But just to clarify, we're talking about, a side note, when we're talking about intervening early, as opposed to the actual specific service of early intervention, also known as Part C. I'd just like to clarify that for some folks. Part C, or early intervention, is one really important part of the continuum of services that we talked about earlier, more on the prevention side of things, but we're talking more generally about early intervention. So again, young children, including very young infants, can and do show warning signs of mental health disorders. This can look like developmental delays, inconsolable crying, failure to seek comfort, a lack of curiosity, among others. And without intervention, serious mental health problems can manifest, including depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit, and on and on. And again, I want to stress that these can be shown in very young babies, as young as 2 and 3 months old. So this fallacy that these don't impact kids just is not true. However, there is good news. We also know that when mental health concerns are identified, there are services and resources available that can redirect the course and place of children who are on the path of risk to one headed for a more healthy development and success in life. So now I'm going to test my limits of technology and attempt to play a short video. We'll see how this goes. I will say, so this is a TED Talk. It's about an 18-minute TED Talk. Obviously, we won't have time for all of that today. I'm just going to show a clip that's a little over 3 minutes. But again, it's in the resources, and I really encourage you to check it out in its entirety after this. So Heaven, I'm going to hit play, and hopefully you'll give me a thumbs up that you can hear it and everything's working. I'm going to fast forward just a bit.
Right on the pebbly shore.
Good.
I want to tell you a story about Joe. Joe's parents were expecting the birth of their second baby. And they had decided that they wanted to spend the first week just at home with the new baby, mom, dad, and the new baby. And Joe would go with grandma and grandpa, who he loved very much, and they had all kinds of fun things planned. He had a present a day to open so he could remember when he was going home. Joe comes home after the 7 days. He's home with his new baby, his mom and dad. That night, in the middle of the night, while Joe's asleep, the baby spikes 105 temperature. Mom, dad, and the baby are air-vac from their rural community to a teaching hospital 3 hours away. Joe wakes up in the morning to a neighbor. The next night, he's at the aunt and uncle's house. The next night, at another neighbor's house. The baby's diagnosis was spinal meningitis. Fortunately, the baby recovered. 2.5 weeks later, Joe, mom, and dad, and the baby come home. Joe is cranky, irritable, not sleeping through the night. He wants to be held all the time. Dad's been out of work for 3 weeks. Mom has this critically ill baby. Now, if Joe was running a fever, was cranky, not sleeping through the night, and pulling at his ear, she'd call her family practitioner and say, I think Joe has an ear infection. Can I bring him in? What does she do in this case when he's showing symptoms? Ideally, this has been a family practice or a pediatric office that has been screening for social emotional health right along with motor development with vision, so that she knows she can call and say, I think Joy's having some difficulty. Can somebody get us some help? They could be connected with a mental health provider who probably would see the family 2 or 3 times. They'd make a plan for Joe in transitions. They'd help him understand, go ahead and hold him. Because as soon as he knows you're not going to leave anymore, he won't want to be held anymore. He's 2.5 years old. Could you have a babysitter come over 1 hour a day to take care of the baby because we know you're worried about her, and you just spend an hour with Joe? A couple times, Joe's back on the path of typical development. It's much like an ear infection. Unfortunately for Joe and his family, they told me this story when he was 5 years old. He'd been kicked out of 2 child care centers. There was no such help. It's interesting. With ear infections, children's anatomy changes so that they're only vulnerable to ear infections when they're very young. And we treat it because reoccurring ear infections lead to later hearing loss. But we don't treat social emotional problems. The National Institute of Mental Health estimates that 1 in 4 adults every year has symptoms of mental health problems. We need to make sure that health is more than growth, that health includes social emotional development. How does that baby go about forming relationships? How does that baby experience and regulate their emotion? And how do they learn? Now we have.
So hopefully that was a little teaser to the rest, but really, I love that because it gives a stark example of how we address and have systems around involving health issues versus social emotional issues. And when she puts it like that, it makes so much sense in understanding why our systems are created so differently. So, hold that thought.
The first one is.
Okay. So, Terry Rose here alluded to the effectiveness of treatment at an early age. And so now we're going to talk about the benefits of some of these evidence-based practices that I just alluded to earlier. We should also acknowledge here that our field has a lot more work to do to really quantify the dollars and cents associated with infant early childhood promotion, prevention, and treatment. However, there is ample research that demonstrates that early prevention and treatment is much more beneficial and way more cost effective attempting to treat emotional difficulties and all of everything that comes with it later in life and become more serious. And when we piece this information together across child welfare, education, healthcare, the economic implications, again, are clear that significant long-term savings and costs can be anticipated based on the use of evidence-based practices for treatment. So here are a few numbers that we feel like are just the tip of the iceberg. So I'm not going to totally go into the weeds, but just a little bit. So a study on parent-child interaction therapy, or PCIT, again, on the treatment end of the continuum, showed a return on investment of $3.64 per dollar of cost. So when it sounds little at the beginning, but amplify that versus how many thousands of kids, that's significant savings. Additionally, in studies of child-parent psychotherapy, or CPP, follow-up studies at 6 months, 1 year, and 9 years, so this is 9 years post-treatment with CPP, have shown significantly better outcomes in treatment groups and measures of kids in cortisol patterns, in behavioral problems, in aggression, in PTSD. Again, all of those things that I'm sure you can relate to how the behavior looks in childcare and school settings. CPP has also shown benefits for families at risk of child maltreatment and those already involved in the child welfare system. So most notably in one study of follow-up study of preschoolers with open child welfare cases, the group that had CPP had a 19% reduction in foster care placements 1 year post-treatment. That was at 2%, compared with the other group, the comparison group was 21%. Again, we're talking huge numbers of kids. And further, another effectiveness study with preschoolers in foster care in Illinois in the Department of Child and Family Services showed a 50% fewer placement changes for the groups receiving CPP. So again, for little ones who get bounced around in our systems, any decrease is helpful, but 50% is just really, really incredible. And these studies, along with what we know about early childhood development, resilience, and health, paint a clear picture of, again, the benefits of investing young. So hopefully I've made the case at this point that it just makes much more sense to do this early. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the barriers to accessing services that are clearly beneficial, because why shouldn't, if they work, why shouldn't anyone who needs them have access to these services? So let's talk about three of the barriers. I know there are others, but we're just going to talk about three right now that unfortunately our littlest ones share the burden, or they are the ones receiving the burden for these multiple stigmas. So the first is really just the stigma of mental health in general. Mental health is one of the only words that when you say it, people evoke the opposite feeling. So when you say mental health, often people hear mental illness, which is always interesting to me. We all have mental health, and we need to be proactive in finding ways to be aware of what our mental health needs are, so that we can better understand the mental health needs of our babies and toddlers. And although I do feel like a silver lining of COVID is that even the general public, I think, is experiencing, and more importantly, talking about on social media and all kinds of things about mental health in different and more normalizing ways, although there's still a lot of work to do. The second barrier is systemic racism and implicit bias that has contributed to communities, specifically communities of color, many of whom don't trust the systems that should theoretically offer help and support, such as the mental health system, the court system, the medical system. And in fact, I was recently interviewing a woman who works with Black moms of little ones in Ohio, and I was asking her about what infant and early childhood mental health services are available. And her response to me was, we, meaning the Black community, we don't have mental health. And she was saying it sarcastically to get the point across, but it led to a much deeper discussion about how these experiences of racism over generations have created very real cultural barriers, and in some cases offered needed protection for families, but have also inhibited people from reaching out and taking advantage of supports and services that are available to help. So this is one huge thing that we as a system really need to tackle head on. There is some really cool examples of services that are gaining some momentum nationally, with professionals of color designing services specifically for their communities. And one example is the Embrace program. Again, you'll get the link in the chat and in the resources to learn more about it. But it's out of University of California in San Francisco, and it's a clinical program designed or developed in order to give Black moms and Black pregnant women an opportunity to receive prenatal care from an intentional angle of racial consciousness. So there's some really cool things that are happening that we want to highlight and replicate when we can. Finally, then there's the barrier of many people not even recognizing that infant mental health is a thing. Again, if we were here in person, this is when I would ask all of you to raise your hand if you've even heard of infant and early childhood mental health before today. And as I touched on earlier in some cavalier ways, but two of the most commonly held adult notions about little ones is that one, they're going to be too young to remember anyway, and two, that they're born resilient and will just grow out of things. But again, because of how we know how brains develop, they do remember, they just remember differently. And these beliefs are so deeply held in society and create this need for intentional awareness campaigns and training and education like this one today. So again, kudos to TJC for choosing this as one of your topics. But we really need to balance, to really shift society's understanding of the fragile nature of babies and toddlers' mental health, and balance the message of, yes, they are vulnerable and they can be resilient with the right supports and resources for the adults that care for them. And this is a great opportunity and a great way for each of you to take steps towards making this cultural shift. So when these myths come up in conversations in your life with family or colleagues, take the opportunity and interrupt and explain why these are myths and what really is the truth when it comes to development. So let's move on to resilience. Resilience is really a term that's getting a lot of attention these days. And one description that I like is the ability to experience hardships in life and not just survive through them, but thrive. And rather than letting difficulties, traumas, setbacks overwhelm or psychologically paralyze, highly resilient kids and adults find a way to shift and to find healing and to move forward. And as the research has evolved, so has our understanding of the concept of what this resilience looks like. And researcher Anne Masden, she wrote a book called Ordinary Magic, which I highly recommend. She states that the idea that there is a general trait of resilience is akin to arguing that there's a general trait of healthiness. Like health, resilience arises from many influences across levels of organisms and their environments. And while some individuals may be blessed with more positive resources and families and immune systems that contribute to their adaptability, much more than a single trait is involved in either health or resilience. So the good news is that this is not something you have or you don't have. Resilience is really seen as this constellation of characteristics that can, or skill sets that can be practiced, but more importantly, can be learned and strengthened. And although this definition feels more individually focused, I want to encourage you to consider that policies too can support resilience on a more macro level. So one of my dear friends and colleagues, Dr. Lee Johnson III, talks about this in his recently published brief. He did his dissertation around this, namely supporting resilience in Black families, advancing racial equity in early childhood mental health policy. Again, you're going to get the link. But here he states that public investment in infant and early childhood mental health is critical to addressing mental health challenges exacerbated by COVID-19 and experienced by Black households. So again, I encourage you to check out his work where he offers really specific policy examples that folks can just pick up and start advocating for in their areas about building resilience as prevention. So what we know about optimal child development is that in order for their brains to be ready to meet the next developmental milestone, which is happening literally at lightning speed, they really need to feel safe, healthy, and securely attached to a primary caregiver. And again, remembering that the mental health is the foundation of all future development. And again, because of this, baby's health is inextricably tied to their primary caregiver's mental health. And the biggest takeaway today that I hope you take is that if you want a baby to have the best chance at, quote, normative development, supporting their parent and caregiver's mental health is the best place to start. And taking a very important step further, again, identifying your own mental health needs, you're hearing me say this multiple times, is crucial to being able to help a parent or caregiver recognize and meet their mental health needs. We call this the parallel process in mental health. You can't have one without the other. Oh, and I didn't even see, I told you I was going to forget this one time. That was a slide you were supposed to be looking at when I was saying all of this, but again, you'll get them. Here we go. So recognizing that knowing and understanding your own mental health needs and well, all needs in general, really takes the skill of self-awareness. One of the most effective best practice strategies to improving and maintaining high quality infant and early child mental health services is that of reflective practice. And this is grounded in self-awareness as well. And some of you may have experience with the formal practice of of reflective supervision consultation, also known as RSC. I'm just going to use that for shorthand. And some may not. But RSC is based on infant mental health principles and was created to support those who really work directly with little ones and their families to help sort through just the very layered and complex emotions that come up when working with them. It is a very specific tool used to improve our interactions and ultimately improve the mental health of those that we work with. And even though it started in the clinical setting for providers of direct services, there's really growing attention and interest in embedding this practice into policy and systems work as well. And it seems really to make sense that if we know that that those who make decisions and policies for families with young children, I'm sure many of you here today, should also have access to supports that we know work to lead to better services for kids and families too. We also know that when we're talking about policymaking and systems building, that to create, again, the greatest positive change for kids and families, it's critical to intentionally and actively center equity with the emphasis on racial equity. And this includes taking time to examine and really reflect on how race and racism and implicit bias interact with power in all of these situations and dynamics, and how they interact with the historical and current policy landscape that many of you are working in. And again, a plug for the diversity informed tenets. We at Ed03 really use them as guideposts for how we can integrate this into our work and our policy work. They offer reflective questions that we found super helpful to guide many of our conversations, and I'm going to share those in just a second. But I really offer these two concepts of reflective practice and centering racial equity together as our field is really discovering that the space created during RSC is an optimal setting for having these sensitive and critical conversations of how racial equity can become operationalized in every aspect from our work from policy to practice. So again, I'm going to read like 3 of these questions just to give you a flavor of what they sound like. They're meant to be vague so that you can they can be integrated in any part of your work. But one is, how is privilege and power shaping this? What assumptions are being made about power? And who's benefiting from this and who is further marginalized? So you can see there's not any magic to them. It's just really the power of taking time to slow down and ask these questions at the tables that we're at. So I'm recognizing we're getting low on time. So oops, back it up. So as we wrap up, I really remind each of you that you have the ability to support infant and early childhood mental health in your own sphere of influence, both personally and professionally. And here are just a few ideas about places to start if you're really committed to advancing infant and early childhood mental health policy and really creating a better system for infants and toddlers in the great state of Tennessee. So number 1, dispel the myths. Again, babies and toddlers do have mental health and they can be negatively impacted. And they are equally able to be taught resilience by attentive and healthy caregivers. Number 2, find out who in your state has an interest in infant and early childhood mental health and make some friends. Again, a great plug for AIM High Tennessee, your state folks, advocacy organizations, university people. Like there's lots of different buckets of folks that in different states and in different ways have an impact on mental health policy for little ones. Number 3, find out how funding and resources are being used, or maybe not yet used, to support infant and early childhood mental health, and ask questions like, what's going on with our child care development block grant? What's happening with our mental health block grant? How about Title V? Keep in mind that especially with the American Rescue Plan funding that's coming in, there are billions of dollars that are up for grabs at this point. And those decision makers at the top, if you start asking questions, they have to start answering them. So help guide them in this way. And last but not least, find ways to build in reflective practice in your work, whether formally or informally. Again, check out the diversity informed tenets, embed some of these reflective questions into the conversations that you're having at tables, both big and small. So I'm going to share one last tool, and then we're going to wrap up. So, oh, here we go again. There you go. So this is a super helpful infographic that, again, is in the chat and resources that 0 to 3 created to really explain what this is and how people fit into it. And I really encourage you to print this out, take it back to your teams and your leadership and your lawmakers to help them understand this critical importance of supporting babies and young kids. And again, we don't expect that everyone be an infant mental health clinician. However, we do know that all adults can really look at kids through a mental health lens and support their mental health. So with that, I need you to pull out your sticky notes or your piece of paper that you had at the beginning. And I know we're low on time, so I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to stop. And I want you to write down 1 or 2 takeaways from today. And then most importantly, I want you to put that then in a place where you're going to see it tomorrow. Because we've all been to really great trainings and conferences where we get super energized. And then the second we leave or go to the next meeting or open your email, it's gone. So take a second, write it down. And when you're done, we're going to do something called a chat waterfall. So type it in the chat, hit enter, and you'll see everybody else's great ideas too. And that's a fun way that we've learned to close. And I was nervous to open the chat and do this at the same time because I thought I would lose my space, but I'm going to try it now just to see your answers. But I will say also, just to show you the rest of the PowerPoint, here's a resource slide that I said is actually there many times. There's our references page. There's our information or my information. Oh, and Angela even put her email address in there. That's great. Very cool. So I encourage you to read through the chat, scroll through it, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pass this over to Heaven for the last few minutes, I think, to see if there's any questions that folks have asked.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. That was very informative. A lot of great resources. We do have one question that came in, and just as a reminder, everyone, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. The question we have came from Karen. It says, can the role of a provider help mitigate the trauma going on at home, i.e. a daycare or early Head Start?
Absolutely. And oh, I know it's so hard to feel like you only have such little time with these little people during the day, and then you have to send them home to sometimes scary or just unknown experiences at home. And that can feel like such a heavy lift. And often, you know, you get a little one on Monday and it takes till Wednesday to get them calm and regulated. And then by Friday, they're anxious again. And it just is this cycle. So 1,000% yes. Every moment that you have is an opportunity to positively impact their mental health. And that can look in so many different ways. Very simply by giving eye contact, using their name, using consistent caregiving, using just so many different strategies. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is, I would say, contact either I have, you know, my contact information here, or again, a plug for Aim High Tennessee. There's lots of different ways, but that's where if you are in those settings, infant and early childhood mental health consultation services, if you can advocate for those or access those in any ways, those consultants are priceless in terms of coming and supporting you figure out all of these different ways to not just support a little one that you're concerned about, but really do more universal policies and practices to support the mental health of your staff, of you, and everyone, including the families that you work with, which also might be building relationships with those families that might seem a little hard to engage, and to the point where maybe even helping support them get some services that they need when they're home. But I know that it's such a hard position to be in, because you love and care for these little ones like your own, and then just have to send them back home to families when you're done with them, and that can be really hard. But yes, that's a great question.
Awesome. I am not seeing any other questions pop up. Wait, there's one more actually. It just came. It says, what resources are available to young adults who have multiple ACEs from age 0 to 5? Example, a child who was moved from home to home in the foster care system at a young age, or is it mostly too late for them by then?
It is never too late. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because although we say so much that we want to intervene in those first 5 years, it's never too late. And there are so many resources. Assuming trauma did happen, mental health resources, finding a really good therapist who knows about attachment, who knows about relationship, who knows about trauma is a really, really good way to do that. You can Google Psychology Today. Psychology Today is a great resource where you just put in your zip code and you put in your insurance, and all kinds of different therapists pop up, especially in this age of COVID. There's many virtual options as well, way more virtual options for therapists than even a year or so ago. So I highly encourage you to check that out, and just reach out often. Your local community mental health agency can help find services as well, but it's never, ever too late. That's the beauty of relationships, that we always can continue to have them and continue to grow. And like I said, that resilience piece, it's not something you have or don't have. There's skills that you can learn. So there's lots and lots of hope.
Awesome, thank you. So it looks like those are all the questions we have. So go ahead and close out. So thank you, Megan, and thank 0 to 3, and thank everyone for attending. Just as a reminder, the slides and a recording will be sent out to everyone tomorrow. Also, I encourage you once again to sign up for some of our upcoming events. Particularly, we have on August 4th, back to school event talking all about the importance of immunizations and vaccines. We'll be having Dr. Dorothy Sinnert and Dr. Barbara Dents, who are pediatricians, talk all about that. And also, if you haven't already, I do want to remind everyone that we recently launched a Black Health Matters campaign, which just compiles a few resources about policies that affect racial health disparities, including mental health and inequities, and also amplifying the voices of those who have these experiences. And as part of the campaign, we have a Black Health Matters pledge that we're asking fellow activists to take. And by signing the pledge, you just are saying you commit to actively working towards health justice so that everyone has equal access to quality, affordable health care. And if you sign the pledge, TJC will be sending you different ways to take action and different resources you can view. So you can find that pledge on our website, and yeah, it's posted in the chat box as well. So thank you all, and thank you, Megan. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. It was great to be with you. Take care.